November 29, 1993 Observer Newsletter, McMahon, Titan face steroid indictments by Observer staff. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 95009. November 29, 1993. McMahon, Titan face steroid indictments. Lawler expects to be cleared of all charges. The charges against Vince McMahon: conspiracy to distribute anabolic steroids and to defraud the United States Food and Drug Administration, during the period from 1985 to February 1991. Maximum penalty, 5 years in prison. Illegal possession of anabolic steroids with intent to distribute, October 24, 1989. Maximum penalty, 3 years in prison. Maximum personal fines against Vince McMahon for both charges, $500,000. Against Titan Sports: conspiracy to distribute anabolic steroids and to defraud the United States Food and Drug Administration, during the period from 1985 to February 1991. Maximum fine, $500,000. Illegal possession of anabolic steroids with intent to distribute, October 24, 1989. Maximum fine, $500,000. Additional maximum penalty against Titan Sports for one or both counts: forfeiture of the land, office building, and everything in it located at 1241 East Main Street in Stamford, Connecticut, aka Titan Towers. Estimated value of office building, $9.5 million. In what could prove to be a landmark steroid case, both Titan Sports owner Vince McMahon and his company were indicted on 2 counts apiece of steroid law violations. The case is believed to mark the first attempt by the U.S. government in enforcing its steroid laws to charge the owner or a key management figure of a sports organization, and the organization itself, which allegedly benefited financially from its athletes' usage of steroids, as conspirators for that use. McMahon, in denying the conspiracy charges, claimed the charge was an attempt to make him responsible for the actions of Dr. George Zarian III, the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania osteopath who was convicted of 12 counts of illegally dispensing steroids and other controlled substances in a well-publicized 1991 trial. Zarian, who is currently serving a 3-year sentence, was believed to have been the main and most well-known supplier of steroids, but was not the only supplier, to WWF wrestlers from the early 1980s through his 1991 arrest. The indictment named Zarian, as well as others who weren't named, as unindicted co-conspirators. McMahon and Titan Sports were arraigned Tuesday morning, November 23 in Brooklyn. McMahon pleaded not guilty on all charges and was released on $250,000 bond before U.S. District Court Judge Jacob Mishler. A May 2, 1994 trial date was set. At the arraignment, McMahon refused to answer any media questions on the advice of his attorney but called the entire proceedings unfair. In a statement issued through his lawyers, McMahon claimed the government's prosecutors are now trying to make me responsible for what the doctor, Zarian, did. I did no such thing. In a statement released to the press, McMahon said, "To turn my personal use into a crime, they claim I shared some of those steroids with a friend and that somehow made me a dealer." The indictments, which resulted from an at least 20-month-long Justice Department investigation of McMahon and his company, never alleged McMahon sold steroids, but that on several occasions around or between March 1988 and October 1989, McMahon and Titan Sports distributed and caused to be distributed the steroid nandrolone decanoate, better known as decadurabolin or DECA for short, to a WWF performer known to the grand jury whose name wasn't listed in the indictment. There is widespread belief within the wrestling industry of who the performer is, and his name was in at least one major media report originally before lawyers for that media service took the name out. If the performer in question is one believed to be within the industry, it would contradict many public statements that performer has made in the past in regard to his involvement with the drugs. McMahon, who after the indictment acknowledged sharing steroids with a friend, but admitted to committing no crimes, contradicted an interview in the Boston Herald a few days before the indictment, when he addressed the potential of a charge for dispensing steroids. Of all the things that have been rumored, the vicious rumors and the lies that have been said about me and this company, no one's ever said that before. Not one wrestler or anyone. So if I had ever given anyone steroids, distributed steroids or anything along those lines, that would have been one of the very first things that someone could have said, yes, he did it to me. McMahon, whose age was listed in all published reports as 47, but is believed to really have turned 48 in August, had, in a July 1991 press conference in the wake of the Zarian trial where the first announcement was made that Titan would steroid test its wrestlers, and in more than one statement to this publication in 1991 and early 1992 admitted personal use of decadurabolin acquired from Dr. Zarian but categorized the extent of his use as briefly experimenting in 1987. On the WWF Saturday Night Radio show, Jim Ross early in the show listed the charges against McMahon, read the company's prepared statement and then largely dropped the subject for the remainder of the first hour. During the opening of the second hour, Ross complained that the government should have had better things to do and that both McMahon and the WWF claim the allegations are groundless and plan to contest these allegations. However, the pleas hardly make a May trial date a certainty. At this point business negotiations will take place, i.e. plea bargaining. There are many who believe a trial, win or lose, would prove devastating for the McMahon empire because it would require numerous wrestlers to testify to their own use of steroids, including the possibility or most of the company's top drawing cards from its heyday. The name Hulk Hogan becomes a key factor. The Zarian trial suddenly became front-page news in USA Today and was scheduled to be covered as significant news in many mainstream media outlets when it was believed Hogan would be testifying. When Hogan's subpoena was quashed, the story took on far less significance initially, although not in the long run. If Hogan were to be called on to testify in a trial with McMahon on the subject of steroids, it would become a huge media event. McMahon is going to continue as lead television announcer and in his CEO capacity with Titan Sports in the wake of the indictments. The government does not allege that I or my company have done anything wrong since the use of steroids became illegal nearly 3 years ago, McMahon said in a story that ran Thursday night on the AP Wire. The World Wrestling Federation does not condone or tolerate the use of steroids. The question of legality of steroids has been misinterpreted by media and misrepresented in statements by many leading wrestling personalities since media scrutiny and controversy regarding the drug being abused by wrestlers started in the wake of the Zarian trial. Since this is a federal case, various state laws regarding use or distribution of the drug aren't applicable to these indictments. Statements made by many wrestling personalities regarding steroids themselves being legal during certain periods was often not the case even before changes in federal law because of state laws in many instances. Simply put, steroids in and of themselves have never been a legal drug during any of this period except for specifically specified instances. Prior to 1988, dispensing steroids was under the jurisdiction of the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. Dispensing steroids was only legal before 1988 under one condition: when use was supervised by a licensed medical practitioner acting within a legitimate doctor-patient relationship. During the Zarian trial, one of the government's key points against Zarian was that his manner of dispensing steroids did not fall within that framework. In November 1988, after a congressional hearing, because it was felt doctors were abusing that specific instance and acting unethically in writing prescriptions and dispensing steroids to healthy athletes, the drugs were placed under the jurisdiction of the DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration. The law was tightened up at this point to only allow steroids to be dispensed or to be possessed with intent to distribute for the specific purpose of treatment of disease in human beings. Any other type of dispensing or distribution was considered a felony. In early 1991, another law was enacted making it a felony for any kind of possession of steroids or use of steroids by individuals for anything other than the treatment of disease. There are no charges in these indictments relating to this final law change. McMahon's statement that the government doesn't allege any wrongdoing by him or his company since use, the key word is use, making his statement true, of steroids became illegal is apparently trying to confuse the press and public and in some cases may have succeeded in regard to the final law change of 1991, which isn't applicable to this indictment, with the fact that other laws pertaining to the legality of the drug had been in effect since the 70s. The press release sent out by the U.S. Justice Department's Eastern District on November 18 announcing the indictment specifically stated, "At all relevant times anabolic steroids have been classified as prescription drugs under federal law and could not be dispensed without a valid medical prescription." It later went on to state, "The indictment announced today charges McMahon and Titan with violations of federal law both before and after the enactment of the 1988 statute." McMahon's attorney, Jerry McDevitt, who was the attorney for Hulk Hogan and responsible for getting him out of testifying at the Zarian trial, in a New York Daily News article called The Indictments, cockamamie, and claimed, "We're going back into ancient and revisionist history to fashion an indictment against Vincent McMahon." The charges against McMahon and the company are significant in the sports and quasi-sports world. If McMahon were to be convicted as being part of a conspiratorial role during the years stated, it would not seem to be a stretch to argue that during the same time frame, college football coaches, bodybuilding promoters and others in ownership or personnel decision-making capacities in sports where steroids offer a competitive advantage or the steroid look increases box office marketability, along with the institution, particularly if somehow a strength coach or administrator provided funds for their purchase, of which they represent could conceivably be guilty of the same offenses. Previous steroid indictments have largely been made against the pawns of a system that creates steroid use from those who strive to reach the top of their profession, doctors supplying them in order to be friends and get favors from celebrities and athletes rather than those who control the field of play and the criteria of how to get ahead. McMahon can be more closely tied to Zarian because he himself purchased steroids from the doctor and was clearly knowledgeable of the situation that Zarian was dispensing steroids to his wrestlers and seemingly took no actions to discourage use in his company until after Zarian was convicted and media pressure followed. Perhaps even more potentially devastating from an industry-wide standpoint than the charges against McMahon personally, who is largely seen as the most powerful and influential individual worldwide in the industry for most of the past 10 years and arguably in its history, are the charges against the company itself. Besides a maximum of $1 million in fines, Titan Sports is facing a possible forfeiture of its $9.5 million office complex known as Titan Towers. The latter, because of the costs of replacing the office and everything in it, would most likely leave the company in a severely financially weakened position and almost force the company into downsizing and rebuilding from a much lower level. A recent conviction of a Puerto Rican baseball team owner for selling cocaine, with the claim he used the team's offices to do so, resulted in the government seizing the entire team from the owner and putting it up for auction. The indictment claimed the object of the conspiracy was unlawfully to provide WWF wrestling performers with steroids to enhance their size and musculature, and thereby to increase the ticket sales for WWF exhibition and the profits to Titan and McMahon. Titan Sports' involvement in the distribution indictment was caused by the allegation within the indictment that on several occasions between March of 1988 and October of 1989, McMahon ordered and caused to be ordered nandrolone decanoate from Zarian, and the indictment claims, in order to evade the detection of these transactions, McMahon utilized Titan funds or resources to cause the purchase of bank checks used to pay Zarian for the shipments, which were then distributed to both McMahon and the unnamed WWF performer. By virtue of the Drug Forfeiture Act, the government, upon a conviction of Titan Sports on either of the counts, is attempting to seize Titan Towers, because it is alleged that office property was used or intended to have been used to commit or facilitate the violations. The indictment also noted that in December 1989, Titan officials and McMahon learned of the federal investigation into Zarian's activities and warned him of the investigation, and at that point prevented him from appearing at future WWF shows. A Titan executive known to the grand jury, with knowledge of the investigation, instructed another executive to ensure that Zarian didn't attend a show in Hershey, Pennsylvania that he was scheduled to be the attending physician at, and to consider warning Zarian of the existence of the investigation. McMahon also discussed this situation with the Titan executive, and the Titan executive phoned Zarian and told him to destroy any records of Zarian's contact with the WWF and with WWF wrestling personnel. In the Zarian trial, Zarian's attorney, Bill Kostopoulos, claimed that Pat Patterson called Zarian to tell them that wrestlers were being investigated, and at that point Zarian turned over all his files on wrestlers to a lawyer. When the FBI raided Zarian's office the following March, there were no files or records relating to medical treatment or contact with WWF wrestlers that Zarian was dispensing steroids to. It was the acquisition of Zarian's FedEx receipts which was loaded with names of pro wrestlers, including major names like Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, Roddy Piper, Ultimate Warrior and Kurt Hennig, and most prominently 36 pounds worth of shipments to McMahon and others at the Titan offices, which led to pro wrestling being tied into the trial and ultimately led to these indictments. In the Boston story days before the indictment, McMahon said, "This oppressive investigation for over 19 months has cost us millions and millions of dollars. I would not want to wish what we have endured already on my worst enemy. Ever. Because it's been unfair, unjust and, as far as I'm concerned, un-American." Lawler case takes bizarre turn. The case against Jerry Lawler on statutory rape, sodomy and harassing a witness charges took a bizarre series of turns this past week. Lawler's attorney William Massey told numerous media outlets in the Memphis area, and the Associated Press, that he had a 4-page written affidavit from the 13-year-old Louisville girl who was listed as the victim in the rape and sodomy aspect of the case, and her mother, recanting their story and saying none of the incidents took place. Both Massey and Lawler spent the weekend telling the media and friends that all charges would be dropped at the arraignment that was scheduled to take place on Monday, November 22. Massey, in an interview before the arraignment, said he'd accept nothing less than a complete dismissal. After the arraignment, where Lawler pleaded not guilty to all 5 charges, none of the charges were dropped. Lawler was freed on a $1,000 bond. Lawler returned to Memphis for largely positive press on Monday night's news shows, saying the procedure didn't allow for the admitting of the affidavit as evidence until a December 6 discovery meeting. Lawler said in an interview with Pro Wrestling Torch later that afternoon that the lengthy article which practically absolved him of all guilt in the previous day's Memphis newspaper was mistaken in its reporting that Massey said he expected charges to be dropped the next day, although Massey was quoted in other media outlets as saying the same thing. Lawler himself had gone on the Memphis television wrestling show on Saturday saying he expected the whole situation to be over very soon. WWF officials had decided that Lawler would return to both his wrestling and announcing duties with the group if or when he was absolved of all charges, but with word throughout wrestling on Sunday that Lawler had been cleared, talk was that he may be back for Survivor Series after all, although there is no confirmation of anything of the like. Earlier in the week, the Nashville Tennessean had run an editorial critical of Lawler, claiming his public explanation of the indictments as exaggerated girl talk didn't come off as plausible. Lawler's only major wrestling appearance during the week he was under suspicion was the November 15th card in his hometown of Memphis. The show drew approximately 1,250 fans and $8,600, an increase from the previous week's $1,100 and $6,600. There was a $1 increase in prices. The debut of Crush in the main event may have been a factor, as well as the local publicity regarding Lawler. Lawler received one of the loudest and most sustained cheers for his ring introduction at the show in recent memory. In an article in the November 21st Memphis Commercial Appeal, Massey was quoted as saying he expected all charges to be dropped at the scheduled arraignment in Louisville. In the article by Michael Kelly, Massey said he met with the girl and her mother at their request in Louisville last week and obtained a statement completely exonerating Lawler. "The young lady says this never happened," Massey said. "It just got blown out of proportion. And when she tried to stop the prosecution, the authorities did not want to. They didn't want to hear the truth." At press time, a Louisville station had already taped an interview with the older brother of the alleged victim, which the station was taking to lawyers to decide whether to air since the older brother was still under 18, which sources say may paint a new portrait of the entire proceedings. Massey said Lawler has given the girl and her mother nothing in exchange for the statement, that no civil suits have been filed in either direction and that there was no monetary settlement. Massey claimed the situation stemmed from a dispute with the girl in question and a family friend that Lawler had no part of. "They have a family friend, who almost sees himself as a fatherly figure to this young lady," Massey said in the newspaper article. "He will constantly probe into where she's going and what she's doing, and he questions her, even accuses her, of going out with people constantly. This gentleman was accusing her at one time, I think it was in September, and he just kept on, and he was saying, 'Who else have you been with?' Just to spite this man and to make him leave her alone, to make him back off of her. She said, 'If it will make you happy, I've been with Jerry Lawler,' and named a few others. This man went to the police and that's where it got started." Massey said the statement also cleared Lawler of alleged wrongdoings in the Indiana investigation, where charges had not been filed. He said the grand jury indictments came without either Lawler or the girl being put on the stand, which seems to make erroneous the report on the WLKY TV news that was reported here and elsewhere last week, quoting detailed testimony from an alleged victim, although many aspects of this story at this point don't seem to make sense. Mr. Lawler sees this young lady as more or less a victim of the system herself, her and her family, Massey continued in the article. "This just got blown out of proportion, and that happens sometimes with major celebrity figures." Massey said that Lawler admitted to meeting the girl when she came to his hotel room at one time and they talked for 30 minutes, but that was the extent of it. There was considerable mainstream media coverage of the McMahon/Titan indictments on Thursday night, with coverage on both the NBC and ABC national newscasts, a brief mention on Primetime Live that evening by Sam Donaldson after a piece of steroid use among high schoolers, and coverage nationally on both CNN and ESPN nightly sports reports. The NBC coverage, ironically from the network that carried WWF specials for years, was the strongest. CBS was planning on a more in-depth feature for its Friday night newscast, but it was pulled 10 minutes before airtime because of a Bill Clinton press conference and may be run sometime in the next week. Coverage was strongest on a local basis in the New York market, where all the leading stations carried the story and at least 2 stations opened the newscast with the indictments as the leading story. Local television and radio carried the story in many markets, although none to anywhere near the same level as New York. On the tabloid scene, Inside Edition ran a 5-minute feature the next day, using tape of a previous piece done in 1991 on the Zaharian trial and updating it only with the announcement of the indictments of McMahon. Newspaper coverage was less significant. The AP ran at least 2 different 5-paragraph brief stories on the indictment and another 11-paragraph story on the arraignment, which were covered throughout the country, but usually just 1 or 2 sentences in the local paper. In the New York media on Friday, the New York Post, which covered this story from the beginning and eventually was sued by McMahon, had a banner cover headline Musclebind Feds Indict Wrestle King in Steroid Pump-Up Scam with McMahon's photo, and ran 2 stories on page 5. It followed up by another story on Monday, which had a quote from Ken Patera saying, "Everybody used steroids. If you didn't use them, you couldn't work for McMahon." He wanted everyone to look like a cartoon character. The most amazing quote in the story came from Craig Peters of PWI, not that it would surprise me he believed it, but that he'd say it for attribution in a newspaper, was, "I don't know if McMahon gave wrestlers steroids, but there was an implicit message that the bigger the bodies, the more impressive the physique, the better chance you have for getting a job with the WWF." Ultimate Warrior was quoted as saying McMahon never told him to use steroids, but that the road schedule and pressure to maintain the Ultimate Warrior character encouraged him to take advantage of every edge, including steroids. The New York Daily News also ran a page 5 story, while the New York Times limited its coverage to 4 paragraphs. USA Today, which has been long known for its decided pro-WWF coverage sometimes to the point of being beyond fiction, and complete lack of negative coverage, ran a 1-paragraph item in the entertainment pages in its early editions, but had pulled the item by the time it ran its West Coast edition. The Boston Herald ran a lengthy interview with Vince McMahon on Sunday, an interview done days before the indictments, where McMahon called the investigation a witch hunt. Forbes magazine is scheduled to do a piece this week. The Miami Herald pulled its weekly wrestling column on Sunday, deeming the subject matter too controversial. The story also received and will receive a surprising amount of coverage in the Japanese press, which largely buried the Zaharian trial story and subsequent follow-ups that were major news in the U.S. Ellis Hennigan of Newsday ran easily the best written piece I've seen, a Sunday feature on Billy Graham, which was the only newspaper story that really captured the essence of the real story. The plight of Graham, as a 50-year-old ex-steroid user for 2 decades, has to be noted as, at least to this point, to be the unfortunate exception, rather than the rule of thumb long-term result. Up to this point, Hennigan's article had also proven to be the unfortunate exception. The arraignment on Tuesday was being covered heavily on local New York television and news radio segments, and is expected to lead to further stories this week. The most ironic thing about the media coverage is this. If a media source never covers pro wrestling to begin with for whatever reason, beneath its dignity, sports editor doesn't think it's sport and entertainment editor doesn't think it's entertainment, etc., it is hard to fault that source for not covering this story, because no mainstream source at press time has understood tying in the conspiracy indictment against McMahon and the company with ramification to many mainstream and cult sports organizations. At some point, those ramifications make this potentially a major sports story, particularly if there turns out to be a conviction on the conspiracy charge. However, any source that has given significant coverage to the industry, particularly during its heyday that these indictments coincide with, has no argument toward not giving the indictment of the company itself and of the most powerful man in the business at least that same amount of coverage. It does point to the sad state of journalism itself in too many cases when the same reporters covering the fantasy aspect run like hell from examining the reality. Many others seem to have confused the issue stemming from the indictments, thinking the ramifications of this story and long-term effects are based on the amount of coverage it received. Media coverage of certain aspects was the significant determining factor in 1992 when allegations were going public. It is almost completely insignificant when it comes to indictments. The only significance when it comes to indictments are the end results of the indictments. As with many drugs, steroids are largely misunderstood by the public and media. Because of their ability to enhance performance in numerous sports where speed and/or power are prime elements, their use recreationally and athletically is fundamentally different from other drugs. Attempts to legislate them may be in a vain attempt to keep the proverbial playing field level rather than to protect society from devastating side effects. While taken for long periods of time in high dosages is presumed to be quite unhealthy, very little in the way of medical research is out there that conclusively proves anything one way or another in regard to either long-term or short-term effects. This allows those who want to justify personal use as claiming there is no proof of what the warning labels claim, and allows those on the other side to exaggerate toxic effects because there is no proof to contradict them, either. Those who use the drugs have quickly learned to shun medical research, which for years claimed no performance-enhancing capabilities to the drugs while athletes were blowing out previous bests in their speed and strength sports while on them. The results of the early research was the first of many lies to be told, as some of the earliest researchers have since gone forward saying the original claims of no bulk or strength increases were actually falsified by those in the medical profession for fear it would create an epidemic among athletes if the truth were to come out. When the epidemic took place anyway some years later, attempts were made to exaggerate side effects, but in many cases that had little effect as a deterrent, and now many athletes don't listen to anything the medical profession says on the subject because of lost credibility. In May of last year, I attended the wedding of a childhood friend in Southern California, a former competitive bodybuilder who once placed in the collegiate Mr. America bodybuilding championship and was a strength coach at a major steroid-laden college sports program. Both himself and his older brother, who I also grew up with, had used steroids for competition purposes. His brother also used steroids and was still using steroids, having nothing to do with competition due to the fact he had the type of personality that would cause somebody to use steroids and brag they enabled him to get it on 32 times in an 8-day period. In the wedding party were several other competitive and former competitive bodybuilders, and in that company steroids is usually the prime subject of conversation anyway, but made more cognizant because it was just a few weeks before what was being heavily publicized locally as a drug-free bodybuilding contest being put on by Vince McMahon, more on that later, the very idea of which was laughable to all. They were joking, knowing without having any tangible proof of what later came out in the bodybuilding mags, but truly knowing from experience, if you get my drift, the misleading nature of that advertising. I made a comment that wasn't meant at all as funny, and that is that the most prevalent side effect of not only using steroids, but just being involved with those who use is not hair loss, acne increase or increased aggression, but a huge increase in lying, particularly when the subject comes up. As every new report comes in and every new statement is made, whether it be by Vince McMahon, or Hulk Hogan, or some members of the medical profession, or athletes in other sports, or many, but certainly not all, wrestlers who have spoken publicly on this subject, it always seems to be suspicious. It often is even a direct contradiction with the same people's previous statement. Charting the history of Titan's statements, both in regard to the WWF and WBF, and attempts at misrepresentation and outright fantasy in them has been done numerous times in these pages. Rather than repeating the obvious, the key points are: Titan Sports' popularity was built on the back of anabolic steroids. There would be no Hulk Hogan if Terry Bollea had not used anabolic steroids. Take Hulk Hogan and everyone else whose character was pushed due to their physique during that time period out of the equation, and Titan Sports would have never achieved anything close to the level of popularity and mainstream appeal it had before the walls of mainstream interest came tumbling down in 1992. Take Terry Bollea out of the equation as the leading star of the company probably would have been another exceptionally big man with a steroided up physique, as every attempt but one as an heir apparent to Hogan has been. Popularity of most, but not all, of the key draws during that time period was based on physiques that could not have achieved or maintained on the arduous schedule without steroids. Vince McMahon was fully aware of all these factors as both a bodybuilder, bodybuilding fan and steroid user himself. His decisions on whom to market and ability to market more than any other promoter during that time period were based largely on physique, which led to what virtually all sources in that time period will concede was far more used within the WWF than any other wrestling company. However, steroids were used regularly in all promotions during that time period and were a competitive advantage across the board and in numerous other sports. To say the WWF when it comes to steroid use is guilty of something other sports organizations aren't would be unfair, although it was more of a prerequisite to get in and get to the top than in most. The only difference is, its pusher got caught, its media and a few members of the mainstream media weren't as apt to let its lies go unchallenged. Its owner was a user and its owner got to choose who won and lost and how, and thus was in complete control over who was and wasn't a star. In a few sports, like bodybuilding, use was probably more rampant than the WWF. Use of steroids today in the WWF is minimal, if at all. Steroid tests aren't foolproof. There have been numerous public statements made to the media on this subject that have turned out to be totally untrue, and not just misleading. There have been questions raised about their accuracy and if enforcement of failures is uniform. If there is truth to those questions, and it has already gone public in a few cases that there has, that would not be unique to the WWF either. Questions have been raised by officials and participants in track, football, and all sports with testing policies, and everyone knows about the dragging its feet WCW has done the past 2 years. Just this past week the NFL was sued by former player Terry Long, who is one of only a handful of players who has been suspended in the past few years for failing a test, back in the preseason of 1991. Long claimed steroid use is encouraged on certain teams, rampant among players, and tests are arbitrarily enforced by the league. His suit claims to have examples of players who failed tests but were never suspended, because they legally challenged the tests and the league ruled the positive results as inconclusive. He even claimed his first test failure, for a higher testosterone level than testing regulations allow, didn't result in a suspension, but his second test, which had a more normal level, did, because then the doctors re-evaluated the results first test. But the policy as is administered in the WWF today is a strong deterrent, and certainly current use among existing employees is strongly discouraged. The recent attempt to build the promotion around Lex Luger does present a strong case that it is still to a young wrestler's advantage if they want a job to use the stuff, pump the weights, and hope the genetics are there to get one's foot in the door. Once they get in, they are most likely not going to get away with use for any length of time. Nothing have to do with this story and these charges have anything to do with what is going on in the WWF today, but laws that are alleged to have been broken years ago. The current drug testing procedures are not relevant to the time period noted in the indictments. There are so many stories, some of which were frustrating to cover at the time because the subject leads to one work, read that lie, after another, and this is hardly limited to wrestling but all aspects of the issue of performance-enhancing drugs in sports, that in looking back, become really humorous, regarding statements made not only by Vince McMahon and wrestlers, but by other major celebrities. One of the funniest stories involving McMahon has to do with the World Bodybuilding Federation. The WBF announced its formation in January 1991. At its inaugural press conference, Tom Plotz, whose position with Titan would have been equivalent to Pat Patterson's in the wrestling end, said the WBF would regularly steroid test the bodybuilders. This was nearly 6 months before the Zarian trial, and there was little mainstream publicity on the subject applied toward either wrestling or bodybuilders and steroids. This statement was made even though there were no plans at all to steroid test, that the word within the industry was bodybuilding the way it's supposed to be. The WBF's original theme was a way of saying bodybuilding without steroid testing. At the time, the rival Weider group had just had its first, and as it turned out last, Mr. Olympia, the 1990 version, with the guys drug tested. Even though virtually everyone used the juice to prepare and some were said to be on as late as days before the show, the flaws of testing are such that only 4 of 21 failed and had to forfeit their spot. When the competitors came out, the truth didn't stop the PA announcer from saying how all these physiques were drug tested and steroid free, which brought out the biggest howl of laughter the entire night. It appeared all the guys had to limit their intake in order to beat the test instead of the traditional going for broke. The fans of the drug-gorged sport were disappointed because the quality of the physiques was the lowest in recent memory. Without ever making an announcement, the Weider organization dropped drug testing from the Olympia, claiming it was cost prohibitive but largely because of fear attendance the next year would drop. However, nobody knew Weider would drop drug testing when the WBF was formed. In the first few months of the WBF, there were no steroid tests. A few months later, in a USA Today article before the first WBF show, Titan again said that all competitors would be tested for steroids before the show. Once again, no tests. It was the WBF lies that made those who followed Titan closely wary when the wrestling tests were announced later that year. A few months after this, after much media pressure on the wrestling company in the wake of the Zarian trial, the WWF held its first drug test. During that same period, I had a lengthy discussion with McMahon and the subject of bodybuilding came up and McMahon told me the bodybuilders would be drug tested just like the wrestlers, and in fact, because they were smarter in techniques of beating the test, even more stringent than the wrestlers. He talked about a meeting he had just had with all the bodybuilders a few days earlier where he told them that they'd be subject to the most stringent drug testing in the history of professional sports, about things that had happened at the meeting, etc., and that all the bodybuilders grudgingly accepted they were being pushed as ambassadors of health, thus it would be hypocritical to be on the juice. He said it might take him 1 or 2 years, but his goal was to present the first professional steroid-free bodybuilding show. During the same conversation, he mentioned that he had just signed Lou Ferrigno of TV's Incredible Hulk fame to the WBF, what a great guy he was, invited me to a press conference in a few days in Los Angeles when the announcement would go public, and mentioned that Ferrigno would be appearing a few days after that on Johnny Carson. Ferrigno went on with Carson and brought up drug testing in bodybuilding, saying that's why he decided to come back to competition after a 17-year absence, and chose the WBF, because it would have the strictest drug testing in all of professional sports. The funny part of all this is that, as time will show, in Ferrigno's mind, and in the mind of the WBF bodybuilders at the time, the strictest drug testing in all of professional sports line that so many were seemingly willing to say actually in the minds of many meant no drug testing at all. I can't even speculate what was in Vince McMahon's mind at this point in time. You see, the meeting with the bodybuilders he was giving me details on never happened. Well, actually, that isn't true either. McMahon may have met with the bodybuilders around the time Ferrigno signed. I don't know if he spoke about steroids or not, but it couldn't have been a major factor because none of the bodybuilders believed they were ever going to be drug tested until a month later. But McMahon did have that meeting he was telling me about. Several months later, when the entire situation regarding Titan Sports and steroids had changed again due to even more adverse media publicity. According to descriptions of the meeting months later in the bodybuilding mags, the most amazing thing is that some of what McMahon told me happened in the meeting a few days earlier, really did happen when the meeting took place months later, almost as if in his mind he was preparing to choreograph reality and, as he often has done, to an extent, succeeded. This was in the spring of 1992, when the media publicity regarding steroids in the WWF, Hogan being less than truthful, exploded with stories in the San Diego Union Tribune, New York Post, Los Angeles Times, People magazine, Miami Herald, and syndicated in numerous other papers around the world. While this was going on, McMahon had his meeting with the bodybuilders and told them he'd have to start testing. It isn't clear what he said, but it was reported everywhere that the bodybuilders were told it was because he was getting negative press and mainly for fear of what would air on the company in an upcoming 2020 special if they pushed the bodybuilders without testing them, which wound up being far more influential because of reactions for fear or what would appear than for what actually appeared. Some of the bodybuilders claimed later they thought he had told one of them what to say beforehand and he directed the meeting, a work unknown to all but the orchestrator. A funny thing happened at the meeting. Most of the guys freaked out about being told to give up all their drugs just 3 months before a contest, despite many willingly spouting the drug-free company line. Preparing for a contest without drugs simply didn't exist in their world. Most knew they'd look, well comparatively, like crap on stage, which by the standards of the industry, most of them did, and the few that didn't were largely accused by the others of figuring out a way to beat the testing, and it would hurt their reputations. One guy more than freaked out. He walked out. I came back because they were doing the strictest drug testing in pro sports. Ferrigno was about 320 pounds at that meeting, just a few months away from being the biggest man ever to get in contest shape. Ferrigno challenged Gary Stridham to take off his shirt and pose down right there because nobody would look good in the real contest, and reportedly telling people that if any of them get caught failing a drug test, it means nothing, but the Incredible Hulk got caught and it went public. As a kid's hero, he'd be ruined. The idea of competing without drugs, as he was so proudly talking of on Carson months earlier, apparently wasn't even considered as an option. Ferrigno quit the WBF after the meeting. Something about him suffering from carpal tunnel syndrome and needing an operation, which, in fact, he was suffering from and was operated on, but had nothing to do with his leaving the WBF, and shortly thereafter joined the Weider organization. McMahon was able to achieve his goal of promoting the first drug-free bodybuilding contest in history a year quicker than he told me he thought he'd be able to. Unfortunately, not all the participants were cooperative, but that didn't change the way McMahon marketed the show. The drug-free was screamed as if it were the words WrestleMania and hyping the ill-fated first and last WBF PPV show. The fact that 8 or 10 weeks before the show, either 9 or 10 of the guys who were in the contest failed the steroid test, didn't even have an effect on hyping the show as drug-free both beforehand and constantly during the show. The guys who failed were suspended for 6 weeks, which meant nothing to the show with the contest 8 or 10 weeks away, and all but one scheduled participated, and it wasn't for failing a drug test but because he was hospitalized. The guys were also suspended from their paycheck, which was serious punishment to the guys, but the company continued to mislead the fans that the contest and all the guys were drug-free. They continued to appear on the WBF television show hyping the PPV, doing exercise routines and talking about being steroid tested and drug-free. While the idea of promoting a show where the majority of participants had recently failed a steroid test as drug-free on the surface was both ludicrous and fraudulent, the funny thing is, when showtime came, it appeared that in the preparatory period for the show among the crew, there was less steroid used than at any contest of that level in recent years. The two questions I've been asked the most in the past few days are: how is this going to affect the wrestling industry? What's going to be the end result from these charges? The answer to both is the same. It's premature to speculate. But given a few possible case scenarios, here's at least an attempt to answer those questions. Assuming no plea bargaining, which is by no means a safe assumption, the end result of this will be the trial. Until that point, don't expect much of an effect on this business. This is not a case where media coverage, whether it be strong, weak, informed or uninformed, is relevant. The decision of the jury, if it goes that far, supersedes everything said or written beforehand. If it goes to trial, everything hinges on what happens during the trial, the verdict and eventual punishment if there are guilty verdicts. That directly leads to question number 2. Vince McMahon and Titan Sports had knowledge of Zara in dispensing drugs. By pushing Hulk Hogan and others with steroid physiques, the decisions encouraged use by most wrestlers hungry for the big money. Whatever danger steroids have over the short and long term, They are hardly the most unhealthy things wrestlers will do in order to get a push. But can a case go to a jury with no knowledge of the subject and be proven beyond a reasonable doubt that this was a conspiracy between McMahon, the company, the doctor and others to get most of the wrestlers on steroids? There were most likely wrestlers during that time period that didn't use steroids and were pushed, although they were probably a distinct minority, but it did exist. A grand jury, to get an indictment only needs a majority vote, or 12 of 23 members. A conviction needs a lot more agreement. On this case, I can't even begin to speculate other than it is going to be extremely difficult for the prosecution without being able to supply strong background of the organization and strong witnesses. As far as dispensing, there are no allegations that Vince McMahon sold steroids to wrestlers, or even widespread gave steroids to wrestlers, although there is an allegations that during a time frame he on several occasions gave steroids to a specific wrestler. If this allegation is true, if McMahon and his attorneys are able to convince the jury that all it was sharing with a friend, they may be able to get a sympathetic reaction and minimal if any real problems resulting from it, even though it would be technically a felony. The jury may react as if it isn't like he was randomly selling cocaine to anyone on the street or anything. If the prosecution is able to convince that this was a promoter giving one of his employees and leading draws, provided this wrestler was one of his leading draws during the time period, steroids in order that he'd be more over and people would buy more tickets to see him perform, thus earning the promoter more money, it could be viewed in a very negative manner, particularly if the company purchases, as the allegations charged with McMahon, could have also been a way to eliminate all paper trails tracing the drugs back to that performer and even make it so that even Dr. Zarian didn't know who his steroids were going to. Either way, it's really the same thing and it all comes down to how the jury interprets it. If the jury believes the charge to be true, it may still come down to who gets the jury's sympathy at the end. Vince McMahon is a master at controlling people's emotions, yet he has a track record of past statements on this subject that could come back to haunt him. Enough evidence could go public, then even a not guilty verdict wouldn't be enough to not damage the company. A guilty verdict has the potential, if McMahon is eliminated from the business and the office is seized, to entirely reshape the wrestling world. But if there is a guilty verdict, will the fact McMahon has spent so much money to alleviate the problem currently be applicable when punishment is meted out, or will the belief be the current philosophy of serious testing was largely a reaction to media publicity and getting truly serious on the subject to the point the habitual users either had to get off or leave was concurrent with the Justice Department investigation of the owner and the company on the very subject? McMahon in some circles has a reputation as something of a Teflon Don with some who don't understand what has happened to the business of Titan Sports the past few years. Some see him as having been invulnerable to all the negative publicity that has come his way in the past 2.5 years. The reality is the company has already lost millions of dollars in revenue and been financially knocked down several pegs in the wake of the negative media publicity of the past 2 years. According to McMahon, he's already spent millions of dollars more attempting to defend himself in regard to legal fees because of the Justice Department investigation. He's taken a terrible hit the past 20 months already, and it may have been more because he's played his cards wrong more often than not when it comes to the steroid story almost every step of the way. That track record shouldn't lead to overconfidence in these proceedings, yet the public "we aren't going to sell this indictment" attitude of many in the company comes across as just that. Judging from the past 2 years, that public posturing may have already wound up creating the biggest problem of all. The inability to learn from one's mistakes has taken much larger companies than Titan Sports and much bigger fish than Vince McMahon down the tubes. Rufus R. Freight Train Jones, a regional wrestling star in the 70s through the early 80s, passed away on the morning of November 13 of a reported heart attack while on a hunting trip at the age of 60. Jones, real name Kerry Lloyd, wrestled out of the old Central States circuit, and moved to Kansas City in 1970 upon getting the job with promoter Gus Karras Heart of America Wrestling Promotions. He grew up in Clio, South Carolina, and started wrestling using the ring name Big Buster Lloyd in the Carolinas. He evolved into Rufus R. Jones when he started in Kansas City in 1970, which quickly became his hometown for the rest of his life. A former football player at South Carolina State University, Jones was a popular mid-card babyface who did the stereotypical role African Americans played in regional wrestling from 1969 to 1987, largely in the Central States, the Carolinas, Virginia, and Georgia. Not known for being a great worker or interview, Jones was a regular in the early 70s in the semi-main events for Sam Mucknick at St. Louis Kiel Auditorium, which at the time was considered by many as the wrestling capital of the United States, and once drew a sellout crowd as a headliner for a 60-minute draw in a world title match with Dory Funk. Jones held the Central States title on at least 3 occasions, the Central States Tag Team title on at least 5 occasions with partners like the Mongolian Stomper, Bob Geigel, Bulldog Bob Brown, Dewey Robertson, and Mike George, along with holding the Mid-Atlantic title in 1983 when the promotion was arguably the top regional office in the country, and Mid-Atlantic TV title twice in the late 70s. After Jones retired, he worked with several ex-Central States wrestlers in security at the Woodlands racetrack near Kansas City before opening the Ringside Restaurant and Bar, which he owned at the time of his death. Final poll results on the clash. Thumbs up, 90, 22.2%. Thumbs down, 251, 62.1%. In the middle, 63, 15.6%. Pillman vs. Austin won the best match with 246, Flair vs. Vader 77. Worst match was Shockmaster vs. Equalizer 156, Hawk vs. Rude 140. Battlebowl PPV was a flop by every standard. Thumbs up, 9, 7.8%. Thumbs down, 106, 91.4%. In the middle, 1, 0.9%. The number of responses was roughly half of a normal WCW PPV, and from early reports, observer reader interest paralleled national interest because the buy rate appears to be between 0.25 and 0.3, around 60,000 buys, easily the lowest for any PPV from a major group in history. Results of the November 20th show in Pensacola, Florida. 1. Cactus Jack and Vader beat Harlem Heat Kane and Charlie Norris in 7:34 when Vader power-bombed Norris. Mean Gene announced Heat Cole by accident at the beginning. Vader and Norris both hurt their backs as Norris jumped up so high on the finish that Vader nearly lost him. Half. 2. Johnny B. Bad and Brian Knobbs beat Eric Watts and Paul Roma in 12:56 when Knobbs pinned Watts using the tights. Roma showed no hints for his ill turn. 3/4. 3. Shockmaster and Paul Orndorff beat Rick Steamboat and Steve Regal when Steamboat hit his partner with Regal's umbrella when Bill Dundee tried to give it to Regal to use in 12:26. 4. King Kong and Dustin Rhodes beat Equalizer and Awesome Kong in 5:55 when Rhodes bulldogged Awesome. Dustin was given no favors on this show. One of the worst matches of all time. 5. Sting and Jerry Saggs beat Ron Simmons and Keith Cole when Saggs pinned Cole after an elbow off the top in 13:14. Simmons turned heel on Cole afterwards. 6. Ric Flair and Steve Austin beat Max Payne and Too Cold Scorpio in 14:31 when Flair made Payne submit to the figure 4. 3/4. 7. Rick Rude and Shanghai Pierce beat Tex Slashinger and Marcus Bagwell in 14:50 when Rude pinned Slashinger with the Rude Awakening. The crowd went nuts for Tex vs. Shanghai for 30 seconds. The other 14:20 of the match was unbearable. -8. Road Warrior Hawk and Rip Rogers beat Davey Boy Smith and Harlem Heat Cole in 7:55 when Hawk threw Rogers onto Cole for the pin. Hawk punched Rogers on the ramp before the match and the other guys stomped on him going to the ring. Terrible match. Great finish. Hawk still was very limited with his knee. 9. Battlebowl was a better than average battle royal for the first 15 minutes or so until it came down to Flair, Vader, Austin, and Sting. It was excellent for the final 10 o'clock. Flair attacked Race on the ramp and Vader came out and splashed Flair on the ramp and he was injured and did a stretcher job to build up Starrcade. Sting was in for a long time getting killed by Austin and Vader and looking for sure like he'd do a comeback win. Vader splashed and squashed Sting numerous times but couldn't put him away. Sting and Austin went over onto the ramp, legal, but Austin fell of the ramp and was eliminated. Vader squashed Sting some more, but Sting made a comeback, but missed a Stinger splash into the corner and flew over at 25:33. Results. October 31st Toyota, New Japan, 4,360 sellout, Manabu Nakanishi beat Tokumitsu Ishizawa, Yuji Nagata beat Tatsuhito Takaiwa, Osamu Kido beat Sean Royal, Jushin Liger and Satoshi Kojima beat Black Cat and Shinjiro Otani, Keiji Muto and Hiroshi Hayes beat Kunyaki Kobayashi and Michiyoshi Ohara, Hawk Warrior beat The Barbarian, Kengo Kimura and Tatsutoshi Goto and Masashi Aoyagi beat Akira Nagami and Takayuki Iizuka and El Samurai, Tatsumi Fujinami and Shinya Hashimoto and Masa Chono beat Scott Norton and Hercules Fernandez and Wild Pegasus. November 2nd Arena Coliseo in Mexico City, EMLL, Olympus and Ultimatum beat Komodo and Ray Barbaro, America and Escudero Rojo and Reyes Veloz IBL Filoso and Talisman Jr. and Ludwig Starr, CMLL Women's Title, La Diabolica beat Cynthia Moreno, Atlantis and La Fiera and Blue Demon Jr. B. El Hijo del Gladiador and Javier Cruz and Cacho Mendoza DQ, Cajos I and Jacques Mate and Massacre B. Pierroth Jr. and Negro Casas and Mano Negra DQ. November 5th Arena Mexico in Mexico City, EMLL, Olympus and Olympico B. Nuevo Links and Rey Bucanero, Arcangel de la Muerte and Guerrero de la Muerte B. Trident and Chicago Express, Cato Kung Lee Sr. and Pantera 2 and El Hijo del Solitario B. Moger and Felino and Tornado Negro I, Chrome and Thor and Rayo de Jalisco Jr. B. Dr. Wagner Jr. and Gran Marcus Jr. and El Gladiador Jr., Atlantis and Corazon de Leon, Chris Jericho, and Ultimo Dragon D. Black Magic and Mocho Cota and Emilio Charles Jr. November 6th Urayasu, New Japan, 315, Yuji Nagata B. Tatsuhito Takawa, Satoshi Kojima B. Manabu Nakanishi, Jushin Liger and Shinjiro Otani B. Tokumitsu Ishizawa and El Samurai. November 6th Corinth, Mississippi, Ringside Riot Promotions, 175, David Wilson B. J.D. McKay Jr., Greg Jones B. The Secret, Ron Paul, DQ, Rick Steele B. Wilson, Paul Henning B. Tank Turner, Wilson and Jones and McKay B. Sergeant O'Reilly and Wilson and Turner. November 6th Mexico City Pista Arena Revolucion, EMLL, Orito and Saigoncito Dragon B. Damian Cito and Ultratum Beta, Mestizo and Talisman Jr. and Gran Apache IB Reyes Velosai and Escudero Rojo and Halcon Negro Jr., Javier Cruz and Moger and Titan B. Americo Rocca and Jinete and Ringo Mendoza, La Fiera and La Sombra and Corazon de Leon B. Negro Casas and Dr. Wagner Jr. and Cacho Mendoza, Hair vs. Hair, Brazo de Oro B. Popotecas. November 7th Arena Coliseo in Mexico City, EMLL, Lady Apache and Xochitl Hamada B. Lady Star and Maria del Angel, Gran Apache I and Mestizo and Talisman Jr. B. America and Astro Jr. and Buffalo Salvaje DQ, Moger and Titan and Jinete B. Trident and Chicago Express and Chamaco Volks, Shockmate and Cajos I and Javier Cruz B. Oso Negro and Americo Rocca and Blue Demon Jr., Supremo 2 and Felino and Black Magic B. La Sombra and Atlantis and Corazon de Leon. November 9th Arena Coliseo in Mexico City, EMLL, Orito and Pontita B. Masacrito and Jacques Matito, Olympus and Olympico B. Ponzonia and America, Moger and Cacho Mendoza and Javier Cruz B. El Hijo del Solitario and Americo Rocca and Oso Negro DQ, Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Dandy and La Sombra B. Dr. Wagner Jr. and Emilio Charles Jr. and Sangre Chicana. November 10th Acapulco, EMLL, Las Zebra Jr. B. Rey Toahomero, Lalo El Exotico D. El Landero, Ludwincito and Aspirantito B. Centralito and Sinistrito, Ludwig Star and Fierro B. Jacu Mate and Tornado Negro I, Atlantis and Dandy and Corazon de Leon B. Mano Negra and Black Magic and Negro Casas. November 11th Hernando, Mississippi, Aswa, 600, Michael Lee B. Rock and Roll Phantom, Don Bass, Little Eagle B. Midget D, American Eagle No. 1, Ken Wayne, B. J.C. Ice, Brian Christopher and Jeff Jarrett B. Reggie B. Fine and Coco Ware, Jarrett B. Honky Tonk Man DQ. November 11th Bremen, Germany, CWA, David Taylor B. Mad Bullbuster DQ, Miles Zerno D. Hiroyoshi Yamamoto, August Smile B. Steve Casey Core, Rambo B. Larry Cameron DQ, David Finley B. Robert Fosser, Franz Schumann and Ulf Herman B. Bruiser Mostino and Rip Morgan. November 12th Juan de la Barrera Gym in Mexico City, AAA, 4000, Fantasma de la Quebrada Jr. and Canaya I and Juventud Guerrera B. Zafiro and Diamante and Brillante, Angel Azteca and El Hijo de Lismark and El Hijo de Tinieblas B. Fantasma and Chicano Power Jr. and Herities, WWA Women's Title, La Monster B. Martha Villalobos, Lismark Sr. and Latin Lover and Salomon Grundy B. El Satanico and Parata Morgan and Angel Blanco Jr., Double Women's Hair vs. Hair Match, La Briosa and Neftali B. Pantera Serena and Wendy. November 12th Arena Mexico in Mexico City, EMLL, 8000, Gran Apache I and El Mestizo B. Escudero Rojo and Reyes Velosai, Metallico and Aguila Solitaria B. Cadaver de Ultra Tumba and Espectro Jr., Los Brazos B. Jacquemate and Cajos I and Bestia Salvaje DQ, Mocho Cota and Felino and Pierroth Jr. B. Atlantis and Ultimo Dragon and Fierro, Negro Casas and Mano Negra, and Black Magic B. Rayo de Jalisco Jr. and Dandy and Corazon de Leon. November 12th Bremen, Germany, CWA, Robert Fosser B. Rip Morgan, Bruiser Mostino B. August Smile, Franz Schumann B. Hiroyoshi Yamamoto, Rambo B. Mad Bull Buster, Ulf Herman B. David Finley DQ. November 13th Chester, South Carolina, North American Wrestling Alliance, 45, one-night tournament for vacant NAWA title, Super Rocker 2, Tommy Welker, B. Paul Jones Jr., Rick Link B. Candy Man, Super Rocker I, Don Herbert, DDQ Hunter Thompson, Buddy Shane B. the Assassin, Ken Boone, Link B. Rocker 2, Shane B. Link to win title. November 13th Bremen, Germany, CWA, Franz Schumann B. Rip Morgan Core, David Taylor B. Miles Zerno, Handicap Match, Rambo B. Larry Cameron and Mad Bull Buster, August Smile B. David Finley DQ, Robert Foster and Ulf Herman B. Klaus Koroff and Eddie Steinblock. November 13th Stoneboro, Pennsylvania, ACW, Derek Domino B. Kabuki Kid, T. Ranchula B. Chopper Davidson, Goodfellas B. Bad Crew DQ, Rip Sawyer B. Glenn Osborne, Lord Zoltan B. T.C. Reynolds, Nikolai Volkov B. Evil Chic, Doink the Clown B. Shane Douglas, Douglas 1 Battle Royal. November 14th Juarez, AAA, 12,000 Sellout, Octagon and El Hijo del Santo and Rey Mysterio Jr. B. Tony Arce and Vulcano and Rocco Valente, Conan El Barbaro and Latin Lover and Pero Aguayo B. Cien Caras and Mascara Año 2000 and Universo 2000 to win 6-team one-night trios tournament. November 14th El Toreo and Now Calpan, Uwa, 2500, Pimpinela Escarlata and El Engendro B. Shogun and Blackman 2, El Hijo de Anibal and El Hijo del Solitario B. Loco Zando Khan and Luis Mariscal, The Killer and Villanos 4 and 5 B. Crypt Keeper, Jose Estrada Jr., and Vita Hiroaki and Black Power 2, El Signo and El Texano and Negro Navarro B. Silver King and Transformer and Super Astro, Connect and Miguelito Perez and Viano 3 B. Enrique Vieira and Gran Hamada and Dr. Wagner Jr. November 14th Arena Coliseo in Mexico City, EMLL, Guerrero Maya and Damian Cito B. Mascarada Magica and Saigoncito Dragon, Damian L. Guerrero and Guerrero del Futuro and Guerrero Maya B. Chicago Express and Metallico and Aguila Solitaria, Oso Negro and Javier Volgs and Americo Rocca B. Popotecas and El Hijo del Gladiador and Gran Marcus Jr. DQ, Mucho Cota and Pierre Oth Jr. and Sangre Chicana B. La Fiera and Ultimo Dragon and Rayo de Jalisco Jr., Mask vs. Mask, La Sombra B. Supremo 2, Supremo 2 Unmasked is Julio Gonzalez. November 14th Bremen, Germany, CWA, Franz Schumann 1 Battle Royal, Bruiser Mostino B. Ulf Herman, August Smile B. Klaus Koroff, David Finley B. Miles Zerno DQ, Rambo B. Hiroyoshi Yamamoto, Larry Cameron and Mad Bull Buster B. Schumann and David Taylor. November 15th Tota, All Japan, 3300, The Patriot and the Eagle B. Satoru Asako and Jun Akiyama, Giant Baba and Rusher Kimura and Mighty Inoue B. Masafuchi and Haruka Eigen and Ryuma Izumida, Danny Spivey and Johnny Ace B. Takao Mori and Dory Funk, Ted DiBiase and Stan Hansen B. Abdullah the Butcher and Giant Kimala 2, Mitsuharu Misawa and Kenta Kobashi B. Dan Crawford and Doug Furness, Steve Williams and Big Bubba Rogers and Richard Slinger B. Akira Tao and Toshiaki Kawada and Yoshinari Ogawa. November 15th Memphis, Aswa, 1250, Jeff Gaylord and Mike Anthony B. PG-13, The Warlock, Dave Heath, B. Del Rios, Midget DB Little Eagle, American Eagles D. Phi Delta Slamma, Loser Leaves Town, Downtown Bruno B. Richard Lee, Dirty White Girl B. Tony Adams DQ, Dirty White Boy and Doug Gilbert B. Moondogs DQ, Jerry Lawler and Brian Christopher B. Coco Ware and Rex Hargrove Core, Aswa title, Crush B. Jeff Jarrett to win title. November 15th Bremen, Germany, CWA, Miles Zerno B. Eddie Steinblock DQ, David Taylor B. August Smile, Rambo B. Bruiser Mostino Core, Franz Schumann B. David Finley, Robert Foster and Ulf Herman B. Klaus Koroff and Rip Morgan. November 16th Chiba, All Japan, 2800 Sellout, Doug Furness B. Mighty Inoue, Dan Crawford B. Tamon Honda, The Eagle and the Patriot B. Dory Funk and Yoshinari Ogawa, Rusher Kimura and Mitsuo Momota B. Haruka Eigen and Ryuma Izumida, Jun Akiyama and Satoru Asako B. Masafuchi and Takao Mori, Steve Williams and Big Bubba Rogers B. Abdullah the Butcher and Giant Kimala 2, Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao B. Tracy Smothers and Richard Slinger, Giant Baba and Mitsuharu Misawa and Kenta Kobashi B. Stan Hansen and Danny Spivey and Johnny Ace. November 16th 29 Palms, California, Iwa, 350, Don Juan B. Larry Ludden, Barbara Blaze B. Victoria Morena, Thunder Machine B. Mr. Outrageous, Brutus Beefcake B. Nails, Tito Santana B. Rick Martel DQ. November 16th Bremen, Germany, CWA, Steve Casey B. David Taylor, Franz Schumann B. Klaus Koroff, Handicap Match, Larry Cameron and Mad Bull Buster B. Rambo, Bruiser Mostino B. Eddie Steinblock, Robert Foster and Ulf Herman B. David Finley and Rip Morgan. November 17, Niigata, All Japan, 3,700 sellout, Masao Inoue b Satoru Osako, Tracy Smothers b Takao Omori, Rusher Kimura and Mighty Inoue b Ryuma Izumida and Haruka Eigen, Johnny Ace and Danny Spivey b Masa Fuchi and Yoshinari Ogawa, Abdullah the Butcher and Giant Kimala 2 b Tamon Honda and Dory Funk, Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Taubi Dan Crawford and Doug Furness, Giant Baba and Stan Hansen b The Eagle and the Patriot, Steve Williams and Big Bubba Rogers and Richard Slinger b Mitsuharu Misawa and Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama. November 17, Tokyo Korakuen Hall, JWP, 2,100 sellout, Cutie Suzuki b Bolshoi Kid, Mayumi Ozaki b Plum Mariko 2136, Devil Masami b Candy Akutsu, Dynamite Kansai b Hikari Fukuoka 2116. November 17, Bremen, Germany, CWA, Mad Bullbuster b Billy Boy Willix, August Smiled Kermile Zerno, David Taylor b Larry Cameron DQ, Robert Foster d Steve Casey, Bruiser Mustino and David Finley b Rambo and Franz Schumann. November 18, Yokohama Bunka Gym, JWP, 5,200 sellout, Chaparita Asari and Chikako Shiradori, AJW, B Candy Akutsu and Fusei Onoki, Mima Shimoda, AJW, B Bolshoi Kid, Manami Toyota, AJW, B Hikari Fukuoka 2255, Akira Hokuto, AJW, B Mayumi Ozaki, Devil Masami and Plum Mariko b Chigusa Nagio and Cutie Suzuki 3304, Dynamite Kansai b Kyoko Inoue, AJW, 2045. November 18, Niagara Falls, New York, WWF, 123 Kid b Johnny Polo, Doink the Clown b Mike Sharp, Rick Steiner b Jacques Roju, Lex Luger b Ludwig Borga, Owen Hart b Adam Bomb DQ, Head Shrinkers b Rock and Roll Express, Bret Hart b Shawn Michaels. November 18, Flint, Michigan, WWF, 1,750, Brooklyn Brawler b Brian Costello, Diesel b Bob Backlund, Coffin Match, The Undertaker b Yokozuna, Men on Mission b Tom Stone and Barry Horowitz, Bastion Booger b Virgil, IC Title, Razor Ramon b IRS. November 18, Akita, All Japan, 2,800 sellout, Mitsuo Momota b Masao Inoue, Tracy Smothers b Satoru Osako, Big Bubba Rogers b Tamon Honda, Giant Baba and Rusher Kimura and Mighty Inoue b Ryuma Izumida and Haruka Eigen and Masa Fuchi, Dan Crawford and Doug Furness b Dory Funk and Yoshinari Ogawa, Abdullah the Butcher and Giant Kimala 2 b Steve Williams and Richard Slinger, Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Taubi Johnny Ace and Danny Spivey, Mitsuharu Misawa and Kenta Kobashi and Jun Akiyama b Stan Hansen and The Eagle and the Patriot. November 18, Tokyo Sumo Hall, Rings, 8,995, Nanyeva Leg b Georgie, George Gundalaki b Masayoshi Naruse, Mitsuya Nagai b Vladimir Petkov, Teriel b Dirk Leon Frey, Chris Dolman b Willie Peters, Nikolai Zuev b Fol Khan, Akira Maeda b Herman Renting. November 18, Lake Hiawatha, New Jersey, East Coast Pro Wrestling, 50, Jason Wright b Bill Cobbs, Devin Storm b Inferno Kid, Kodiak Bear b Gino Caruso, Annihilators b Dennis Knight and Black Champion, Vinnie Powers Tour Italian Stallion, not PWF wrestler of same name, Rocky Jones b Metalhead. November 18, Plant City, Florida, Plant City Wrestling Federation, Latin Fever b Ray Diaz, Raul Mata b Sonny T, Luis Estio b Rick Thames DQ, Rico NC Nuclear Assassin, Luscious Luke b Max the Destroyer, Rocky Johnson and Cody Wade DDQ Jerry Flynn and Ned Brady. November 18, Ridgecrest, California, Iwa, 550, Don Juan b Larry Ludden, Barbara Blaze b Victoria Morena, Mr. Outrageous b Thunder Machine, Tito Santana b Rick Martel DQ, Brutus Beefcake b Nails, Blaze and Machine b Outrageous and Morena. November 18, Quitman, Texas, World Class, Tasha Simone Love b Mad Madeline, Mike Davis b Black Bart DQ, Bubba Fangman b Ray Evans, Scott Putski and Stephen Dane b John Hawk and Alex Porto, Kevin Von Erich b Rod Price. November 19, Syracuse, New York, WWF, 2,150, 123 Kid b Johnny Polo Half, Doink the Clown b Mike Sharp Dud, Rick Steiner b Jacques Roju, Lex Luger b Ludwig Borga Dud, Owen Hart b Adam Bomb DQ Dud, Head Shrinkers b Rock and Roll Express, Cage Match, Bret Hart b Shawn Michaels Half. November 19, Tokyo Korakuen Hall, FMW 2150 sellout, Masato Tanaka b Koji Nakagawa, Battle Ranger, Yuka Hidewaino b Tatsuhiro Kuroda, Katsuji Ueda b Masaru Toi, Ricky Fuji b Dark Ranger, Big Titan b Hideki Hasaka, Sapuri Mac and Shark Tsuchiya and Crusher Matamari and Combat Toyota B Nurse Nakamura and Yuki Nabano and Miwa Sato and Megumi Kudo, The Gladiator, Mike Alfonso, B Katsutoshi Niyama, Dr. Hannibal, Steve Gillespie, and Dr. Lucer, Len St. Clair, B Damien and Sabu, Street Fight, Atsushi Onita and Tarzan Goto and Samba Asako B Mr. Pogo and Mitsuhiro Matsunaga and Hisakatsu Oya. November 19, Lenore, North Carolina, SMW, 225, Prince Carsby? Tim Horner B Killer Kyle, U.S. Junior title, Chris Condito B Bobby Blaze, Bruise Brothers B Heavenly Bodies, SMW title, Dirty White Boy B Brian Lee DQ, White Boy 1 Battle Royal. November 19, Querétaro, AAA, El Solero and Super Colo and Torero B The Rose and Rudy Reina and Mayflowers, Katana and Volador and Solar IB Angel Azteca and Winners and Misterioso, Mascarada Sagrada and Octagonchito and Angelito Azteca B Espectrito and Espontito 1 and 2, Fantasma and Angel Blanco Jr. and La Parca B Mascara Sagrada and El Hijo de Lismark and Tinieblas Jr. DQ, Triangular Mask vs. Mask Match, Angel Mortal B Rey Mysterio Jr., Mortal B Bandito Core, Mysterio Jr. B Bandito, Bandito Lost Mask, WWA Welterweight title, El Hijo del Santo D Heavy Metal. November 19, Chiba, All Japan Women, Kumiko Maekawa B Yoko, Chikako Shiratori B Chaparita Asari, Suzuka Minami B Tomoko Watanabe, Yumiko Hata B Saki Hasagawa, Manami Toyota B Takako Inoue, Asia Kong and Akira Hokuto B Tashio Yamada and Kyoko Inoue. November 19, Dallas Sportatorium, GWF, 1219-88 paid, John Hawk B John Armstrong, Bubba Fangman, Iceman King Parsons B Raving Robert, Chris Adams B Alex Porto, Scott Putsky B Rod Price, Guido Falcone and Vito Mussolini B Chaz Taylor and Stephen Dane, Bullrope Match, Mike Davis B Black Bart. November 19, Victorville, California, Iwa, 625, Don Juan B Larry Ludden, Victoria Morena B Barbara Blaze, Mr. Outrageous B Thunder Machine, Tito Santana B Rick Martel DQ, Brutus Beefcake B Nails, Blaze and Machine B Morena and Outrageous. November 19, Carson, California, Indiana, 725, Renegado Estrada and Flammarion B Scareface and El Pumpa, Frankenstein and Black Angel B Sagrado and Dynamic Jr., Ponky Boy 2 and Mather and Machina Infernal IBL Baron and Flash and Pequeno Alcone DQ, Predator Al Final and Tramaco Rebelde NC Tlaloc and Tornado Negro 2 and Poison, Kiss and Jalisco I and Rayo de Jalisco Jr. B Loverboy and Cesar Sando Jr. and Javier Llanes. November 19, Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, TWA, Frankie Lee B Jamie Strong, Outlaw No. 1 and Texas Assassin B Nasty Critters DQ, Tracy Black B Danny D, Billy Montana and Ken Arden B Johnny Blaze and Woody Woodchuck, Rick Justice and Sam Colt B Frankie Lee and Joel Travis, Rawhead Rex B Randy Steele. November 19, Dallas, North Carolina, PWF, 87, Flaming Youth B Cruel Connection 2, George South, Star Rider B Masked Maniac, Italian Stallion, DQ, Russian Assassin B Hillbilly, JR Scruggs, South and Terry Austin B Southern Rockers, Austin Steelker Texas Outlaw, Stallion B Black Scorpion. November 20, Philadelphia, WWF, 6800, Owen Hart B Dwayne Gill, Doink the Clown B Mike Sharp, Rick and Scott Steiner B Johnny Polo and Jacques Rojoux, Lex Luger B Ludwig Borga, Adam Baum B 123 Kid, Head Shrinkers B Rock and Roll Express, Cage Match, Bret Hart B Shawn Michaels. November 20, Utsunomiya, All Japan, 2700, Mighty Inoue B Masao Inoue, Yoshinari Ogawa B Satoru Osako, Abdullah the Butcher and Giant Kimala 2 B Tamon Honda and Dory Funk, Giant Baba and Rusher Kimura and Mitsuo Momoda B Masafuchi and Haruka Eigen and Ryuma Izumida, The Patriot and the Eagle B Dan Crawford and Doug Furness, Stan Hansen and Danny Spivey and Johnny Ace B Steve Williams and Big Bubba Rogers and Richard Slinger, Mitsuharu Misawa and Kena Kobashi and Jun Akiyama B Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao and Takao Mori 2559. November 20, Tokyo Korakuen Hall, New Japan, 2000 Sellout, Satoshi Kojima B Yuji Nagata, Black Tiger, Eddie Guerrero, B Shinjiro Otani, Osamu Kido B Brad Reingens, Scott Norton and Hercules Fernandez B Hiroshi Hayes and Manabu Nakanishi, Keiji Muto B Mike Enos, Blake Beverly Jushin Liger B Michiyoshi Ohara, Tatsumi Fujinami B Great Kabuki, Masashi Aoyagi and Tatsutoshi Goto and Kunyaki Kobayashi and Kengo Kimura B Takayuki Izuka and Akira Nagami and Masa Chono and Shinya Hashimoto. November 20, Yamato, FMW, 3058, Kuroda b Gasaku Gasegawara, Sapuri Mac b Nurse Nakamura, Battle Ranger b Masato Tanaka, Sabu b Dark Ranger, Crusher Matamari and Shark Tsuchiya and Combat Toyota b Megumi Kudo and Keiko Iwam and Yuki Nabano, Riki Fuji DDQ Damien, Big Titan, and the Gladiator b Hideki Hasaka and Masaru Toi, Dr. Lucer and Dr. Hannibal b Tarzan Goto and Koji Nakagawa, Street Fight, Mitsuhiro Matsunaga and Mr. Pogo and Hisakatsu Oya b Atsushi Onita and Samba Osako and Katsutoshi Niyama. November 20th, Pikeville, Kentucky, SMW, 550, Tim Horner b Killer Kyle, U.S. Junior title, Chris Condito b Bobby Blaze, 3-on-2, Bruise Brothers b Heavenly Bodies and Jim Cornette DQ, non-title Street Fight, Dirty White Boy b Brian Lee, Bruise Brothers 1 Battle Royal. November 20th, Naguriyama, All Japan Women, Chikako Shiratori b Yoko, Chaparita Asari b Kumiko Maakawa, Suzuka Minami b Saki Hasegawa, Minami Toyota and Akira Hokuto b Tashio Yamada and Kyoko Inoue, Asia Kong b Tomoko Watanabe, Eagle Soai and Yasha Kurenai b Yumiko Hata and Takako Inoue. November 20th, Sapporo, WING, the W. Inger b Haido, Hideo Takayama, Shoji Nakamaki b Ryo Maike, Nobutaka Araya b Masayoshi Motegi, Leatherface, Rick Patterson, and the Boogeyman, Eddie Gilbert, b Geto and Jado, Freddy Krueger, Doug Gilbert, and Crypt Keeper, Jose Estrada Jr., b Headhunters, Crash the Terminator and Miguelito Perez and Nakamaki b the Moondogs, Bubba White and Bill Smithson / Aswa Moondogs, and Haido. November 20th, Nashville, Aswa, 300, Del Rios b Tony Falk, Phi Delta Slamma No. 1 b American Eagle No. 1, Ken Wayne, Phi Delta Slamma No. 2 b American Eagle No. 2, Danny Davis, JC Ice b Tony Williams, Jeff Gaylord b Wolfie D, Midget D b Little Eagle to win Mask, Gaylord b Reggie b Fine DQ, Loser Leaves Town, Downtown Bruno b Richard Lee, Brian Christopher b Rex Hargrove, Aswa title, Jeff Jarrett b Warlock DQ. November 21st, Hartford, Connecticut, WWF, 5400, Adam Bomb b 123 Kid, Rick and Scott Steiner b Jacques Roju and Johnny Polo, Diesel b Bob Backlund, WWF title, Yokozuna b The Undertaker, IC title, Razor Ramon b IRS, Lex Luger b Ludwig Borga DQ, Head Shrinkers b Rock and Roll Express. November 21st, Dallas, Big D, 127, Chris Rocks b Ray Evans, Jimmy James b Alex Porto, Mr. b John Hawk, Big D b El Brujo, Gary Young and Rod Price b Terry Sims and Mike Davis to win held up Big D tag titles. November 21st, Takagawa, WING, Moondog Spike b Ryo Maike, Moondog Splat b Haido, the W. Inger b Masayoshi Motegi, Boogeyman and Leatherface b Miguelito Perez and Crash the Terminator, Freddy Krueger and Crypt Keeper b Shoji Nakamaki and Nobutaka Araya, Barbed Wire Match, Headhunters b Geto and Jado. November 22nd, Kumagan, New Japan, 1820 Sellout, Tokumitsu Ishizawa b Tatsuhito Takawa, Manabu Nakanishi b Shinjiro Otani, Black Tiger b Yuji Nagata, Michiyoshi Ohara b Satoshi Kojima, Brad Reingens and Masa Saito b El Samurai and Osamu Kido, Kunyaki Kobayashi and Great Kabuki b Akira Nagami and Takayuki Izuka, Kengo Kimura and Tatsutoshi Goto and Masashi Aoyagi b Jushin Liger and Hiroshi Hayes and Keiji Muto, Masa Chono and Shinya Hashimoto and Tatsumi Fujinami b Scott Norton and Hercules Fernandez and Mike Enos. Special thanks to Steve Dr. Lucha Sims, David Stebbins, Karen Moore, Dan Paris, Tony Sabaf, Norm Connors, Gene Restaino, Paul MacArthur, Stuart Kemp, Freddie Fargo, J.D. McKay Jr., Shelby Adcock, Jason Meyer, Matt Jack, Brett Whalen, Dave Shearer, Brian Hildebrand, Shannon Rose, Roy Lucier, Tony Friedman, Hartman Scoot. Week News Highlights. Randy Savage to replace Mr. Perfect in Survivor Series, which is expected to do the lowest buy rate of any WWF PPV show in history. Speaking of the show, Jeff Gaylord is telling people he's one of the Knights. Sid Vicious and Arnold Anderson are each suspended without pay. The company has publicly yet to acknowledge this, and is still advertising them as appearing on upcoming house shows on television shows that aired as late as this past weekend. Japanese sources claim the ultimate fight was predetermined for Gracie to win. It looked real to me. Funk vs. Sabu on December 26 in Philadelphia. Stan Lane is headed to WWF as an announcer for the face-to-face segments. A selfish reason to hope Lawler is exonerated soon is that you won't have to hear that Rio Rogers character. UFI is remaining strong in Japan as the December 5th Takada vs. Vader show has a huge advance. However, Rings is taking some lumps, as it was unable to come close to selling out Sumo Hall on November 18th, because of the popularity of Pancrase. From what I'm told, in Japan, most fans saw UFI as a more realistic-looking New Japan-style promotion with angles, whereas Rings was a hardcore thing that expected to be real. Unfortunately, Pancrase, by its style, has shown what a shoot really looks like, and Rings fans aren't the kind who largely want to see stiff realistic working matches like UFI fans. Maeda's matches have pro wrestling psychology. Maeda gets beat up and twisted around for several minutes, but makes a comeback to dramatically win, and Pancrase has no psychology since a shoot can't. Chigusa Nagio, the biggest superstar in the history of women's wrestling, looks to be coming out of retirement full-time next year to work for JWP. The divorce of El Hijo del Santo is getting monstrous tabloid press in Mexico, including numerous covers that hardly present one of AAA's top babyfaces in a favorable light. Santo's estranged wife, Silvia Tovar, released all her divorce papers, wanting custody of the two kids. In the divorce papers there are wife-beating charges, and one magazine printed 6 of Silvia's pictures of Santo without the mask and revealed him as Jorge Guzman, and she also released a 1980 photo unmasked of the original El Santo before his death. The wrestling mags are trying to push him like crazy right now so the tabloid stories don't take him down, but magazine covers with headlines saying the end of the legend were in Mexico City the past 2 weeks. Speaking of Santo, his WWA welterweight title defense in a face-versus-face match with Heavy Metal should headline this coming Saturday's Galavision card, which ends in a draw. Roddy Piper's movie Back in Action debuts in Japan in a few weeks. Atsushi Onita was invited to be in the Royal Rumble and will accept, so he'll join Tenryu and Kabuki, and in exchange it is expected Onita will appear on WWF cards in Japan next year. Randy Savage was a big hit at the WWF press conference last week in Tokyo, although the press conference announced nothing. Onita is filming a movie in January in Japan which could keep him from doing the Rumble, but is said to be working hard to free that weekend. Ted DiBiase suffered a neck injury early in the tag tournament, severe enough to be sent home and be out for the rest of the year. Giant Baba will take his place as Stan Hansen's partner for the rest of the tour, although Stan had to give up the 2 points he and Ted had won. Tsuyoshi Kikuchi is also out of action with a broken shoulder and won't return until February. Terry Gordy is scheduled to return after being out 6 months after being in a coma from collapsing on an airplane to Japan on January 16. TV ratings for the weekend of November 13 to 15 saw WCW Saturday and Raw both do 3.1. WCW was headlined by a 30-0-0+ match with Flair and Anderson vs. Vader and Austin on top, All-American 2.0, Main Event 1.9, Power Hour 1.8 and Mania 1.4. Prince Cars The Mummy, managed by Daryl Van Horn, debuted November 19 in SMW and flopped big time. Cars was Rob Mays of Pittsburgh, who worked as Grim Reaper for 1 week in Memphis last year and on a few videos as Molokai, one of Kevin Sullivan's disciples on SMW shows. Vader beat Ice Train in the finals of the Jesse Arm Wrestling Tournament for the fall and winter. In syndication in January, Michael Hayes turns heel and will feud with Bad. Vicious was still on all commercials and being plugged in interviews as appearing in Battle Bowl as late as the day of the show. In fact, many others listed as being in Battle Bowl, Pillman and Ice Train come to mind, weren't there, and it appeared the 40 wrestlers to be picked from were really 33, only Kent Cole, who is injured and can't wrestle anyway, was seen in the locker room but didn't appear on the show. Obviously the cards were at work as there were far too many cards in the cage for the number of wrestlers. But the whole thing was a mess. Some changes in WCW hierarchy. Sharon Sidello will work most of the year out of Europe selling syndication. Mike Weber will take her duties in marketing and PPV, and Chris Potenza takes Weber's PR duties. Feel sorry for him. Eric Bischoff missed Battle Bowl as he spent 4 days in Japan trying to work out a talent exchange deal with New Japan and appeared to be wanting to learn how they do what they do. AAA IWC scheduled for dates on February 19, 1994 in Chicago, February 21, 1994 at the Paramount in New York, and March 12, 1994 at the Los Angeles Sports Arena, and will return to San Jose the same weekend as Los Angeles. Randy Savage was announced as being stripped of the ISWA Unified title for failure to defend it within 30 days, and a battle royal was held on November 22 in Memphis. It came down to Lawler and Jarrett, with Jarrett turning heel on Lawler and pinning him using the trunks to win the title. Earlier Buddy Lindell won the ISWA title from Jarrett, with Jeff still as a face in that match. Jarrett is heading full-time to WWF, so after this week will only work spot dates in Memphis. Crush had apparently won the ISWA title from Jarrett on the November 15 card, when Tony Adams gave Crush a foreign object to use on Jarrett for the pin, but Eddie Marlin came on television and said the Rules Committee is tired of outside interference and was giving the title back to Jarrett. Warlock in Memphis is Dave Heath, formerly Vampire Warrior. Also on the November 21st show, Lawler and Christopher beat Ware and Hargrove, and by pre-match stips, Tony Adams had to eat dog food, really corned beef and hash in a dog food can. Dutch Mantle also returned to Aswa this week. Matches added to the January 4, 1994 Tokyo Dome this week were 10-man tag with Kido and Black Cat and Satoshi Kojima and Manabu Nakanishi and Yuji Nagata vs Shiro Koshinaka and Kengo Kimura and Kunyaki Kobayashi and Michiyoshi Ohara and Great Kabuki, Takayuki Izuka and Akira Nagami vs Masashi Aoyagi and Akitoshi Saito, Shinya Hashimoto vs Masa Chono for the IWGP title, and most likely but not yet announced, Riki Choshu vs Yoshiaki Fujiwara. Overall, the most lackluster Dome show lineup ever. Sumo wrestler Yasuda's debut will be held back to February. Pat Tanaka starts with FMW in January. December 15th at Sumo Hall is a special card for Tenryu's 30th anniversary in combat sports, sumo and pro wrestling. They will do a film feature on his sports career before the show, although at this point All Japan, where he spent his pro wrestling heyday, is refusing to release footage. Tenryu vs Fujinami, Ultimo Dragon vs Atlantis for UWA middleweight title, Warlord vs Earthquake John Tenta, where Warlord can win only by slamming Quake 3 times, Mil Mascaras vs Grand Marcus Jr., Koki Kitahara vs Hiroshi Hayes, King Haku and Masao Orihara vs Ishinriki and Ashura Hara. JWP announced its biggest show in history will take place on May 22, 1994 at the Ariake Coliseum, 12,000 outdoor arena, called Super Major Queens Ariake Clash. Yokozuna and Mr. Fuji appeared on NBC's Conan O'Brien show on November 21st, and the Hart family scheduled for Regis and Kathy Lee to plug Survivors. All Japan on November 15th did a 3.3 rating, airing the second night of the tag tourney. Pancrase pushing a major show January 19th in Yokohama. Full debuts December 16th and December 17th at Korakuen Hall for Oro Memorial Nights with Brazo de Plata, Pantera 2, Cassandro, El Incognito, La Sombra, Rocky Santana, Guadalajara Warrior, Scorpio Jr. and Gran Hamada already announced. Glenn Jacobs, who will probably be one of the Knights, debuts for PWFG on December 5th against Fujiwara. Top matches for the December 5th Shingu Stadium, UWFI, Shoar Vader vs Takada, Hashimakov and Berkovich vs Albright and Severn, Dennis Kozlowski vs Kiyoshi Tamura, Yoji Angio vs Billy Scott, Kazuo Yamazaki and Mark Silver vs Naoki Sano and Yuko Miyato. November 14th at Arena Coliseo saw La Sombra win a mask vs mask from Supremo 2, who turned out to be Julio Gonzalez. La Briosa and Neftali won a double women's hair vs hair, beating Pantera Serena and Wendy when La Monster interfered and tossed Tabasco juice in Serena's eyes on November 12th at Wanda La Barrera Gym. Poor Serena, first a beer bottle over her head, juicing every week, now Tabasco juice in her eyes and being shaved bald. The tag tourney won on November 11th in Tijuana by Santo and Octagon was for the Tijuana Cup. The Pacific Northwest tag belts they were wearing were actually the belts they had won a week earlier from Love Machine and Eddie Guerrero that are being called AAA World Tag Team titles. Brazo de Oro won a hair match from Popotecas on November 6th. Vampiro Casanova has been out of action this entire month due to an asthma attack. Mario Prado Sr., who passed away on November 3rd, had a 40-year career as a wrestler and was 78 at the time of his death. He was the first wrestler ever to use a vampire gimmick. His son Mario Prado Jr. is a co-booker for EMLL. A rookie wrestler named Hermes was shot and killed working in a pharmacy in an attempted robbery on November 12. Espectro de Ultra Tumba has gone back to wrestling as Grand Cochise in Guadalajara. El Coloso retired after losing a hair match to Gran Hamada. Biggest show of the past week in Japan was the JWP card at Yokohama Gym on November 18, drawing a sellout 5,200 and told it was an excellent show. All Japan won every mixed promotional match except the main event, with the key wins being Manami Toyota over Hikari Fukuoka and Akira Hokuto over Mayumi Ozaki. Chigusa Nagio did the job once again in her return, teaming with Cutie Suzuki to lose to Devil Masami and Plum Mariko in 33-04. While JWP won the headline match with Dynamite Kansai pinning Kyoko Inoue. In some ways it's sad to see Nagio try a comeback full-time in 1994, as her era is simply over. Nagio was the hero in the mid-80s to the junior high and high school girls when women's wrestling largely drew from that audience. Today's women's wrestling draws from the hardcore wrestling fan audience, and while they've all heard of her, They never saw her in her heyday, so her incredible popularity of the past doesn't mean that much. All Japan January 2nd to January 29th tour has Hansen, Ace, Tommy Rogers, Bobby Fulton, Chris, and Mark Youngblood, Abdullah the Butcher, Giant Kimala II, Gordy and Steve Williams. Rock and Roll Express worked the entire weekend for WWF, putting over head shrinkers every night. Awards balloting responses, categories listed in November 8th Observer. For the 1993 Observer Readers Awards are now being accepted through the next month. Because of Christmas and New Year's mail, please mail all awards ballots by December 25th to ensure inclusion in the poll, as every year numerous ballots arrive late. You can also fax ballots in. Deadline for receiving ballots will be the first week of January.